Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Rachel is off tonight, but she will be back Monday. It's Friday night, which these days means we should be bracing for just about anything to happen at any moment. Friday seems to be the day when everything happens all at once. So we are ready for anything. But in the meantime, consider the week we have just had. And consider the week the president has just had. We are used to the news cycle moving fast now, how quickly one narrative can be replaced by another. But it was just 1 week ago that Donald Trump was in the midst of probably the best news cycle of his candidacy. Now, in normal times, not being explicitly charged with a crime would be a pretty low bar to clear for a president in a given week. But these are not normal times, and the president and his supporters 1 week ago were reveling in his not being recommended for indictment. He was claiming total exoneration by the report from special counsel Robert Mueller. His complaints that it was all a witch hunt had been vindicated. In fact, his allies said that now the tables were going to turn. All the people who had wronged him, well, now they were going to be at the receiving end of investigations. But the past week has maybe not gone how Trump planned. The cracks first started to show a week ago tonight when Attorney General William Barr sent a third letter to Congress about the report delivered to him by Mueller. Only the first letter he sent was actually required. The second letter, in which Barr offered his own gloss on Mueller's findings, was what the president used all week last week to claim vindication. In his third letter, Barr told Congress that whenever he managed to get the Mueller report to them, they would not see the whole report, that a lot of material in 4 broad categories would be redacted. And oh, by the way, Bill Barr also did not like the way his previous second letter had been characterized. Please do not call it a summary of the Mueller report, he said. That apparently was bothering him. At which point it started to seem like maybe Bill Barr was kind of making it up as he went along. He had issued 3 letters in a week about the Mueller report, but no more than a couple of sentence fragments from the report itself. Well, last night, we got the 4th installment of Bill Barr Wants You to Know a Thing About the Mueller Report. This last one came after Mueller's team, federal prosecutors, and FBI agents who had worked in relative radio silence for 22 months suddenly started to make some noise, triggering an avalanche of reporting about how Mueller's team is frustrated by the way Bill Barr characterized Mueller's findings, that it is actually a lot worse for the president than Barr let on, and that they had specifically crafted their final report, quote, so that the front matter from each section could have been released immediately or very quickly with minimum redactions. The work would have spoken for itself. In the wake of those reports, the Justice Department last night said, no, none of the Mueller report could be released because of a pro forma stamp on the top of each page. A legal disclaimer, you see it here, noting that it may contain confidential grand jury material, and therefore the Justice Department argues it could not be publicly released. Every single page has this stamp on it. Cannot release any of it. All of this comes as the House Judiciary Committee this week has authorized a subpoena for the Mueller report. Its chairman, Democrat Jerry Nadler of New York, insists that his committee will get it.
To do our job, we need the Mueller report, not the Attorney General's summary or a significantly redacted version of the report that the Attorney General has offered to give us without the underlying evidence collected by the special counsel. The release of the report in its entirety is part of what we have to do, but an essential part of what we have to do to make sure that this president and future presidents are accountable to the Constitution, are accountable to the people, and are accountable to the democratic institutions of this government.
Jerry Nadler was speaking at a protest yesterday outside the White House. It was one of hundreds of protests held all around the country demanding release of the full Mueller report. Those protests would seem to be the latest indication that the White House is losing its grip on the Mueller narrative and that the story of exoneration is giving way to the sense that, in fact, the Trump administration is hiding something by not allowing the report to be released. So, fair to say that this week has not been as good as last week was for Donald Trump, and that this is only when it comes to the Mueller report. This is only on one front. Congressional Democrats are also pressing ahead with their investigations into Trump's finances. We learned this week that committee chairs have requested records from one of Trump's banks, as well as from his accounting firm, as part of their various corruption, counterintelligence, and financial fraud investigations. The companies said they would hand over the records if they're issued subpoenas. Lawmakers say they'll happily oblige. Now, this week we also got the first White House whistleblower to come forward publicly on the record. Tricia Newbold, an 18-year veteran of the White House Personnel Security Office, has sounded the alarm to Congress and now to the public about what she says are deeply troubling practices in giving out security clearances at the White House. Tricia Newbold says the Trump administration overruled at least 25 security clearance denials made by career government employees. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is reportedly one of the people who was given a clearance despite career officials raising serious red flags and recommending that he not get one. Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings has now subpoenaed one former senior official in the White House Security Office, and he says more subpoenas are coming. Meanwhile, dozens of other whistleblowers from across the government are reportedly also working with House Democrats on a range of issues, so Tricia Newbold is likely just the tip of the iceberg. Also this week, Congress delivered not just a foreign policy rebuke to Donald Trump, but an historic one. Yesterday, the House joined with the Senate, with bipartisan majorities in both chambers, in passing a resolution to end U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, which is the first time Congress has ever successfully invoked the 1973 War Powers Resolution. Who says Trump can't bring Congress together? Also this week, the president folded on his renewed push for a Republican plan to replace Obamacare. Right in the middle of his victory lap over the invisible but exonerating Mueller report last week, Trump announced that Republicans would come up with a new, amazing health care plan for the country. This week he said that meant they would do that after the 2020 election. He never meant they would do it right now. And then yesterday, after days and days of insisting he would close the border with Mexico, economic consequences be damned, unless Mexico did something or unless Congress did something, it was never quite clear what he meant. Yesterday, Trump completely caved on his threat and settled for a vague warning to Mexico, and pretending that Mexico has changed its policies this week to meet his demands, even though Mexico says it did no such thing. Speaking of pretending, Trump was at the border wall today, admiring his wall. But meanwhile, he was hit with 2 new lawsuits from the House of Representatives and from 20 state attorneys general seeking to block his emergency declaration that would ostensibly fund that wall. We're going to have more on that in just a moment. But of all the things that have gone wrong for Trump this week, the thing that may be bothering him the most is the thing that brought us to the metaphor portion of the news, and not the subtle kind. Quote, "This is a hill, and people would be willing to die on it." A member of the Trump administration telling CNN today that if Congress wants the president's tax returns, they had better be willing to climb a very steep, very symbolic hill leading all the way to the Supreme Court. The next big fight in Washington kicked off this week when Democrat Richard Neal, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, sent this letter to the IRS, politely asking to see 6 years of tax returns from the president and his business. He cites an arcane piece of tax law that allows him to see any American's tax returns as long as it's for a legitimate legislative reason. Now, in this case, Congressman Neal says this has nothing to do with partisan politics. He says he needs the president's tax returns to check in on how the IRS, quote, audits and oversees the federal tax laws against a sitting president. Now, right away, the president was adamant that he would not release his tax returns without a fight. He says the law is 100% on his side, that the IRS has no reason to give in to the Democrats' request and turn over his returns. And today, the president escalated that fight over this by hiring a lawyer. a lawyer who sent this letter to the IRS, calling into question the legal ground that Democrats are standing on. Quote, I write to explain why Chairman Neal cannot legally request and the IRS cannot legally divulge the president's tax returns. Requests for tax returns and return information must have a legitimate legislative purpose. Chairman Neal's requests flout these fundamental constitutional constraints. Ways and Means has no legitimate committee purpose for requesting the president's tax returns or return information. Chairman Neal wants the president's tax returns and return information because his party recently gained control of the House. The president is their political opponent, and they want to use the information to damage him politically. So the initial legal battle lines appear to have been drawn today, and the president says his side is ready to fight all the way to the Supreme Court. What's the view from the congressional side? Well, joining me now is Congressman Dan Kildee. He's a Democratic member of the House and Ways and Means Committee, which has asked the IRS for the president's tax returns. Congressman Kildee, good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me on.
The president's lawyers, Congressman, have told the Treasury Department that your committee's requests for his taxes, for Donald Trump's taxes, has no chance of standing up in court because it's politically motivated. What's your response?
Motivated. And, Chairman Neal, who I think has done an extraordinarily good job of handling this, faced a lot of criticism because people said he wasn't moving fast enough. Look, there's a legitimate public policy question that the Ways and Means Committee is attempting to address, and it's not up to the president or some lawyer that he hires to determine for the Congress when it has a legitimate public policy question that it's attempting to address. That's up to us. We have a separation of powers in this country. The Constitution makes it clear that we have the authority to exercise our responsibilities. And Section 6103 of the tax code makes it crystal clear that the chairman of the committee can order a tax return to be delivered to him in order to inform the committee when it's deliberating on a public policy question. There's a big question as to whether or not the IRS is legitimately exercising its responsibility to audit the president and enforce tax law on him. He says he's under audit. We've asked for, the chairman has asked for 6 years of returns for the president and 8 separate entities. I don't believe it's possible that every one of those returns is still under audit. And even if it is, there's nothing in the law that says the fact that the returns might be under audit somehow exempts them from this 98-year-old law that gives the chairman of the committee the ability to access any taxpayer
So, Congressman,
return.
to be clear,
not just some taxpayers, any taxpayer return.
But to be clear, your public policy objective, because that's what you'd have to prove in court, your committee would have to prove in court, is that the IRS may not be doing what it should be as it relates to auditing or managing the president's taxes.
We have very serious questions as to whether or not the IRS is properly enforcing the tax law. And of course, those questions are made a little more relevant when we see the president's lawyer writing to the commissioner of the IRS, essentially threatening them or ordering them to take certain actions relative to this request. Who's in charge here?
So the IRS commissioner, Charles Rettig, had written a piece in Forbes before the election basically arguing the case for Donald Trump not to disclose his taxes. What's your thought on that?
Well, then I would suppose the commissioner has a bias, which maybe he ought to set aside and actually just look at the law. I mean, he can have his opinions as to whether the president should voluntarily release his returns, but he can't have an opinion as to whether or not this law, which was passed in 1921 following the Teapot Dome scandal, that gives this extraordinary authority to the chairman of this committee. He doesn't get to have an opinion as to whether on this day, relative to this particular taxpayer, the law governs. The law is the law, and he should follow the law.
Congressman, last night the New York Times reported that President Trump had asked Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to prioritize the confirmation of the IRS counsel, reportedly indicating that it was a higher priority than confirming William Barr as the Attorney General. The Times said the president made his request on February 5th. That was well after your committee had made it public that it would be seeking the president's tax returns in the new Congress. Do those two things have a connection to you?
Well, it's certainly curious. I mean, the president seems quite willing to use his authority to defend himself personally whenever he wants to. And again, this just elevates our concern about this question. We are considering legislative proposals that could change the way the IRS deals with presidential tax returns, largely because this president is the most opaque president in recent history. I mean, he broke with nearly 50 years of tradition by first promising and now absolutely refusing to release his tax information. And let's be clear, there's also a legitimate question here, a legitimate public value in knowing whether or not the president's personal financial interests, which he claims and we know to be quite vast, which he still has control over, whether those interests somehow influence the public decision-making that he's engaged in. There's a legitimate question here, and we need to know whether or not in that context, in that already really interesting and difficult context, whether or not the president or the IRS itself is somehow engaging in a way that does not fully enforce the tax law on the president of the United States. He says he's under audit. We don't know that he's under audit. The law doesn't require an audit. There's been a practice of the IRS to audit presidents who are holding office, but there's no law requiring it. So we have an absolute right to be informed as we make these very difficult decisions. The idea that the president is somehow uncomfortable now because he's trying to keep something from the chairman of the committee. Now, these returns wouldn't be made public. This would be for the chairman of the committee in order to evaluate the policy questions that we're trying to address. That's a legitimate public purpose.
Congressman, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thank you, Ali.
Congressman Dan Kildee of Michigan. All right, coming up, they had fun hats and long capes and big gowns. And they're making an unexpected cameo in the newest legal fight against the Trump administration. We'll have that story next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.